All right. Thank you all for coming today. As I was saying earlier, I'm Jenny Paxson. I'm the Reader's Discovery Librarian here at the Webster Public Library. And we are happy to partner with Parents Helping Parents Coalition of Monroe County to host Dr. Shanlian today for Better Sleep for Kids, Basic Myths and Strategies That Work. Dr. Shanlian is a licensed psychologist and board certified specialist in behavioral sleep medicine. He is a founder of KDS Psychological Services, PLLC, and formerly served as Director of Pediatric IDD Behavioral Health Services at URMC. His clinical work has focused on children and families with autism, ADHD, developmental disabilities, and complex behavioral and sleep concerns. And without further ado, I would love for Dr. Shanlian to go on with his presentation.
All right, sounds good. All right, can everyone still see these slides?
It looks good.
Okay, and can they see the advancing of the slide too?
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, so I think what I would like to kind of start off is a little bit of like a familiar scene. And I think about, imagine it's 8:15 at night. You've done everything you were supposed to do. Perhaps the bath is done, pajamas are on, the lights are dim, the book's been read. Maybe you even have like a white noise machine, a weighted blanket, blackout curtains, and a carefully chosen bedtime routine that maybe you found online. And your child is still awake. So not just quietly awake, but then like maybe even suddenly energized, despite looking tired like an hour ago. You thought that maybe they'd even fall asleep on the couch. They might be asking for another snack. They need one more hug. They might even remember something scarier from earlier. They're maybe even jumping on the bed, crying because the blanket doesn't feel right, or saying, I'm not tired, even though everyone in the house obviously knows that they're tired. Um, at some point, you just start wondering as a parent that, is this normal? Should we be stricter? Do they need melatonin? Is this autism or is this part of their quirks, ADHD, anxiety, behavior? And maybe the most painful question is, why does bedtime feel like this is the hardest time of the day? Uh, and I would like to say that these are pretty much like the normal thoughts, like in lots of ways, because when sleep's not going right, you're just like trying to figure out like play detective really quickly and deeply. Um, but and this is what this talk is about. It's not just about how many hours children should sleep, whether screens are bad, melatonin is good or bad, and that bedtime routines matter. But really just how to make sense of children's sleep in a way that's realistic, hopefully compassionate, and actually useful. Because the truth is, sleep advice can sound very simple from the outside. In fact, most of the time when you get professional advice, in my opinion, it's almost sounds like you're obviously doing something wrong. It's your fault. But when you're the parent in the room at 9:30 p.m. and with a child who just seems like they can't settle, it really feels simple. And odds are you've already tried quite a few things. So we're going to talk about a little bit about like what's developmentally typical, what could signal a problem, what myths can lead families in the wrong direction or just kind of get them off track, and what strategies are actually supported by the evidence and what we know about pediatric sleep so far. It's a relatively new field, to be honest, if you think about the length of other kinds of fields of study. So, and although I have entire other talks on this subject, we'll pay special attention to children whose sleep may not follow the usual script, such as children with autism, ADHD, other developmental delays, maybe more obvious anxiety, sensory, or neurodevelopmental differences. But it's not going to be completely focused. I have different talks for that. But my goal is that you just leave here, whoever is attending, that if you're feeling blame, you're leaving with less blame, less confusion perhaps, and a few maybe realistic ideas of what you can use at home or certainly the direction to go. And I mean, if it makes anybody feel better, my third child, I had to re-sleep train him like 4 times before the age of 2. And so, um, my first two children were what I call potato babies. I could put them anywhere and they'd fall asleep if they needed to. But my third taught me quite a bit of like, oh, this is what it looks like when you have a little bit more of a spirited child, and things aren't quite just flowing very easily. So today's plan, you know, is that it's not about blame and shame. We're going to go over a number of these different kind of topics areas. And I also just want to really quickly just touch on the fact that, you know, when a child is not sleeping well, it rarely affects like only the child. It's usually kind of taking over the entire household, especially if they have things that are happening like really in the middle of the night, right? And so it just adds a whole lot of like stress and a wearing down of the patients and everything else. So just want to acknowledge the fact that like even though we're talking about the child, I'm hoping that this also does any clues or any other ideas for like just like around the entire family, and recognizing that any plan that ever has come up with for somebody or a child, like obviously should be including the entire family and thinking about them as a whole. So I think I kind of like already went over some of this at the previous slide. And so I think we're just going to move forward with this. I did it. Jennifer, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I've been doing so many different things in the world of like neurodevelopmental differences for over my entire career that I've done a number of different things, but I'm not going to rehash many of the things that Jennifer already shared, but I do tend to focus and have focused on more kind of complex cases in most of my situations because that's usually what my job demanded. Um, and specifically, my role in pediatric sleep medicine was kind of focusing on a number of different medically complex kids, kids that also we just had run of the mill kinds of things that we'll talk about here today as well. And also, um, again, maybe some other kind of more specific kind of difficulties, things like apnea and other complications, and using devices that help the people breathe through the night and things like that. Needless to say, what's interesting about this is that there are some caveats to how some of this what we talk about tonight is kind of individualized more so with kids with developmental differences. Um, my hope is that regardless, you can take whatever we talk about here because there are some basics around pediatric sleep medicine, real world, and then bridging together what we also know just about like neurodevelopmental care, because that means we can really individualize things. And the goal is that, again, we can just kind of find something that helps all families. So let's start with why sleep matters. It's a kind of like a silly thing to say. I think we all know that it matters, but I usually kind of try to mention to folks that really sleep, in terms of how we view it, is a 24-hour process, and what happens overnight often really just kind of shows up the next day for most of us. Attention, mood, learning, behavior, flexibility, frustration tolerance, emotionality, especially, and certainly family stress. So many families kind of come in saying bedtime is the problem, but the reality is, like, when we look at usually kind of like just like the bigger picture, the 24-hour picture of sleep, bedtime is usually only like one part of the problem. There are other things like that kind of like often kind of show up, things with the morning routine, things with school functioning, emotion regulation, caregiver exhaustion, all these things. So the impact kind of like gets spread all sorts of places. And then I think that's why sleep deserves attention, right? So it's one of the main levers that we have. I think about the focus that I had in terms of like my practice or my career. It's like, what do I usually focus on? I make sure that I had programs and clinicians that would focus on sleep, eating, and sleeping, like sleeping, eating, peeing, and pooping. Cover the three. If you could get those three down for like a family into a consistent, predictable pattern of and knowing what they're doing and where they're going and what needs to be done, you've already solved like a huge majority of things. And specifically in the developmental disability kind of areas, I would say it's particularly important because there are like, for lack of a better term, there's like these periods of arrested development. Your child is growing chronologically in years, but developmentally and their adaptive skills are still staying in like this area of like, oh, maybe they're still in a very early developmental period. So sleep deserves attention for everybody. I think it doesn't mean that improving sleep is going to solve all the problems, but I do think it makes a lot of other issues like much more easy. We could talk a lot on sleep and correlations with like your lifespan outcomes, mental health, et cetera, because there's a lot of interesting data out there. Um, But I often think that when we think about sleep, we treat it as negotiable. We're like, I can kind of breeze by here. I can skip it here. I can trade, shave off an hour here. And it's not that that can't happen. It's just that there's consequences, and depending on how much it happens over time, it could show up, quite significantly as a problem. So I always often tell people too, like if you have to assume that if evolution could have figured out a way across all species, especially at least mammals, especially, to not include sleep as part of life, it really would have done so by now, assuming you take a perspective that life has been on here for Earth for millions of years. But it's the case is like it's not figured out a way to just short circuit it. All sorts of creatures need it, right? So so it definitely affects learning memory. It helps children consolidate what they learned during the day, be more ready to learn the next day. Affects mood and regulation. You are correct, and likely have experienced that poor sleep can make children more irritable, more anxious, more emotionally reactive, more easily overwhelmed. Especially if they're losing a lot of their REM sleep in the night, which is usually happening kind of like right in that early morning period. Thinking about that time between like 3 and 6 or 3 and 7 for most folks. Sleep also affects, the behavior and attention. In adults, sleepiness often looks like, oh, I'm just kind of like slowing down, like I'm just kind of not, doing things as fast, kind of dazed. But in children, obviously, we can get that reverse. Sleepiness can look like hyperactivity, impulsivity, silliness, defiance, not cooperating. Sleep also obviously matters for like, huge like physical health, especially for immune functioning. There's a lot of research around why that matters. Obviously, growth and safety, because most of kids' growth hormones are being released at night, right? And there's the family system. So bedtime battles, night wakenings affect big people's sleep. And when caregivers are exhausted, it becomes harder to stay calm, consistent, patient. You're just quicker at the end of your rope, and it's hard. Um, so obviously, it's important. It affects more than nighttime. Uh, One of the first things I often try to think of when I talk to families about sleep is that you're not alone. That sleep problems are pretty common in childhood. It just waxes and wanes. Obviously, it depends on what kind of like the child that you have. Um, many children have periods of like, bedtime resistance, night waking, early waking, or regular sleep. If you're lucky, that kind of just happens periodically, and you can kind of move along. Um, Unfortunately, in children with autism or ADHD, developmental disabilities, other neurodevelopmental differences, sleep problems are more common and they're a little bit more chronic in general. And it doesn't mean that every sleep problem is serious. Many things simply resolve in time. However, it means families should not assume that they're the only ones struggling. There's a lot of, you know, I thought I was going to have an easy time with my my third child. I did not. And so there's still some, more trickiness going on. But the goal is just basically, I would say, like, don't panic about obviously every sleep difficulty. You just need to understand what pattern you're dealing with, and assuming there is a pattern, whether it's affecting the child, you as parents, or the household. So I want to move into like a very simple model of like how sleep works, right? And these are things that you could just you could Google this, right? So there's a lot of ways to explain sleep. I'm going to give you a framework that families can usually kind of like remember, and it's not complicated. I often say that sleep depends on three things. Um, Usually it's kind of like sleep need, right? So how much sleep do you need? Sleep opportunity, how much sleep is available to you, and then actually your sleep ability, how good is your system basically at achieving sleep. So sleep need includes things like sleep pressure. So sleep pressure is simply how long the child's been awake and how much sleep their body needs, usually as a result of being up during the day. Sleep opportunity means the schedule of like the day for the person, the environment, and routine that actually allow sleep to happen. Because sleep is usually not really something to think of as something that you do, even though it's a behavior. Is falling asleep, especially, is something that happens to you, and you're just helping the situation happen. Sleepability means the child is able to settle, regulate, feel safe, tolerate the environment, and transition into sleep. So when we understand sleep, I think in this particular model of what I'm talking about, it's not really asking about like, what's the bedtime routine? You can stop that. You can just start asking like, which part of the sleep system is not lining up across the entire 24-hour period. So a little bit more explicitly, a classic way to explain sleep is a two-process model. The first process is that sleep pressure. Sometimes in nerdy articles, you'll see it referred to as homeostatic pressure, sleep pressure. So sleep pressure just builds the longer we are awake. One way to think about that is from like the moment that like light hits your eyes, the brain keeps track of your time awake. And as we stay awake, sleep promoting chemicals such as like adenosine and cortisol, um, maybe not so much cortisol building up, but that's certainly an important part. But adenosine, especially, just increases that drive for sleep for sleep as the day goes along. I always like to think of it as like the moment that again, wake up, light hits your eyes, and you could picture, you know, theoretically like a person with like a knapsack or a backpack on their back. And for every hour that they're awake or that kid is awake, it's like putting a brick of adenosine in the back of it. And once it gets heavy enough, um, you know, then, it's time to stop, lay down, fall asleep, and things like that. But you need that buildup. The second process is the body clock, and that's our circadian rhythm. The system just simply helps, with your alertness across the day. Melatonin starting and stopping, body temperature rising and falling, and the sleep window. So it helps with a number of different parts of sleep and alertness. So one of the things I often emphasize to families is that your child's not like a toy with batteries, and sleep happens simply when the battery like runs out. It's actually more the case that a child could be very tired and still not fall asleep if that body clock isn't really lining up. It's not signaling that it's the right time to fall asleep. So another way to think about these two processes in terms of pressure and then like your clock is kind of like a gas pedal and a traffic light, right? So sleep pressure is the gas pedal and it gives the drive for sleep, but the body clock is like the traffic light. And so if the traffic light is red, simply pressing on the gas harder just doesn't do much. So it's kind of like a wired and tired, perhaps. Now, how much sleep do children need? It just changes with age. Many of you guys have seen these charts. This is probably something you probably even get from your pediatrician, right? This is all in your pediatrician well-child visits and the anticipatory care that they try to give you. What I usually kind of say is like, I don't know. These are just guideposts. Like, I mean, some children need more, some less. If you got more than one kid yourself, you recognize that maybe your even sleep needs within your family are really quite different. It's not just about the number, it's about like how they're functioning during the day. And so a child sleeping slightly outside the recommended range could be functioning beautifully during the day. And then a child technically within the range could present as exhausted or dysregulated or struggling. So I would not use these numbers to create anxiety. I would simply use this as a starting point for asking better questions. And by the way, like whatever surveys or whatever you get these numbers from, depending on what source you have, like National Sleep Foundation or wherever, it truly is. We get these guidelines simply by asking parents, like, how much does your child sleep? We just do it through surveys. There is no empirical data set that will tell you like this is how much children need. It just it doesn't work that way. So when is actually asleep a problem? I think that's an important question too. I've certainly have seen families in my practice before where they describe what's going on. Ultimately, to get to the question of like, well, is this a problem for you? And they're like, no, but someone told me I should just come over here and I should see somebody. And a medical doctor might have a certain perspective, and then you come to a psychologist and you're like, yeah, but like if it's not bothering you and it's not bothering your family and they get enough sleep and they're functioning well during the daytime, I don't know, seems like things are going pretty well. I don't think you need to do anything. I'm not sure this is a disorder or a problem. So there's that. Now, I would say sleep challenges are developmentally expected. Occasional night waking is pretty normal, right? Very normal. There's kind of sometimes some temporary regressions at times associated with a number of developmental stages. Some bedtime fears are common, taking 10 to 30 minutes. Pretty typical. As a matter of fact, in the sleep world, if you can fall asleep within 30 minutes, most people are going to say like you're falling asleep within a typical amount of time, even your kid, right? So, but if it starts to go beyond that, like 45 to 60 minutes, you're getting more severe bedtime battles. They're sleepy, dysregulated during the day. The family's chronically sleep deprived. I would say that might deserve some attention. Obviously, if you're seeing sort of like snoring, breathing pauses, gasping for air throughout the night, choking, or just really restless sleep, those are some red flags, of course. And again, not to say, like hammer this home too much, but like it's really so sleep is so cultural in some to some extent. I have a lot of families that come into clinic or they come to see me before, and they kind of get shamed for like co-sleeping, especially at later ages. And the first thing I do is I say, like I don't care if you co-sleep, like it's not really a big deal. It's again like if it's not a problem for you at this stage and you're happy with the situation and everyone's getting enough sleep and you don't want to change anything, you probably don't need to change anything. But my takeaway for most of the thing is like, when is it actually a problem? Is that, normal does not always mean easy, right? So even sleep when it's normal can be hard with kids. And just because it's common doesn't mean that you have to live with it, but it's your choice. It may not necessarily even be a disorder. So moving on to common myths, and I was having a hard time like kind of figuring out which myths I would kind of like cover for this, but these are some ones that often come in to view most often. So I often find this is actually part of one of my most useful parts of conversation with families, because again, families hear lots of advice, you see lots of advice. Some of it's helpful, some of it's kind of oversimplified, even when it comes from your doctor. And so, and then some of it, I think, just really kind of makes parents feel like kind of worse without actually giving them like a better plan. So the goal here is not to make sleep sound complicated for the sake of being complicated. The goal here is to replace overly simple advice with more accurate, more useful ideas. So one of the things that comes up most often is, if they're tired, they're asleep. This is kind of like also something I see in my autism communities with parents who have kids that are reluctant to eat. They're like, well, if you just don't give them like all the other junk that they want or the restricted food that they want, eventually they'll eat, right? And the truth is, I've known a number of kids they will not eat, surprisingly, and it gets to a breaking point really quickly of, just because they're hungry doesn't mean they'll eat. If they're tired, it doesn't also mean that they'll just sleep. So uh, the hard thing is that like a lot of children don't actually look sleepy when they're tired, to be honest. In fact, sleepy children could become again like more active, more emotional, sillier, all that kind of stuff, especially for young children and a lot of kids with ADHD, autism, neurodevelopmental differences. So waiting for obvious like sleepy cues can backfire. Is kind of what I've learned over time and would kind of be suggested by most of my colleagues. I would say by the time the child looks obviously tired, they're just probably going to be dysregulated. So what I often suggest instead of this is a better way that parents could be directed is that really just kind of track the actual sleep pattern. There's really no substitute for just really kind of tracking what's actually happening. The sharpest pencil's better than the dullest mind kind of idea. Um, and just doing that over time. When is this child actually falling asleep? What time do they wake up? Did they nap? How long were they awake before they slept? How well did they wake up? So in terms of addressing this myth, I would say like don't rely on how tired they look. Just really kind of like watch the pattern for when they are actually kind of like falling asleep and getting sleepy. Um, or in some ways, all this is really resolved by simply kind of like sticking with the schedule. And sometimes I also get this as well because a lot of families, especially right now, summer, maybe not today because today looks like it's some sort of like apocalyptic sky outside. It's very orange here in Rochester due to the Canadian wildfire smoke. But during the summer, parents will report like, oh, my child is, they're out in the summer, they run them ragged and they come home and then like they're just tired and they pass out, and so much easier to do bedtime and whatnot. there's a kernel of truth like in this a little bit. Physical activity is good for kids. It supports overall health, regulation, mood, sleep health. There's like really solid data on all of that. But exercise does not actually guarantee sleep. So sleep is really just not about burning energy. It still depends on like all that body clock, that circadian timing. So you could have a kid that could run around all day and still be unable to fall asleep if their body clock isn't ready. And so, late intense exciting activity can also increase arousal for some kids, but this also is like pretty varied. You'll find that may or may not actually suit your kid. It may not matter. So uh, some children have a hard time like kind of like just like settling after that kind of activation. Some could fall right asleep like in 5 minutes after that kind of activation. But there's just, again, no real substitute to observing and noting how your kid seems to operate over time. So although I would say physical activity supports sleep, you can't outrun the body clock. So you really do need all these things to really line up together. It's not just like, oh, I could just solve everything by just like running them ragged and getting them like really tired through activities. It's not necessarily going to be the answer, and certainly not the sole answer. This one kind of gets pushed out in a number of different ways. The worst place that this kind of gets really talked about is like these kind of in really like infant sleep, to be honest. They talk about wake windows, which really wasn't a thing until like maybe, I don't know, like 10, 15 years ago or something like that. It was like a term that didn't really get used, but now it's like really popular. But the idea of a perfect bedtime window. So overtiredness is real. We all know that kids can become harder to settle if they're overtired. But there's really just not like a magical universal bedtime that works for every kid. Again, your best bedtime just depends on your child's wake time, nap time, if they are napping. So timing of the nap, not just how much they nap, actually matters a lot. And obviously their sleep needs as an individual child, what their circadian rhythm is looking like at that time for like waking and kind of alertness. And then also like when they're kind of tend to be getting tired. And of course, actually when they're falling asleep. So all those things together, actual wake up, actual sleep onset, napping and time and amount and all that. So if you have a child that you put to bed at 7:30 but does not fall asleep until 9:15 every night, 7:30 is probably just not a realistic time yet. And maybe it used to be, but it's not anymore. So it can change. So what your child is actually probably doing during this time between 7:30 and 9:15 is that they're learning that bed is a place to be awake, frustrated, and engaged with parents, and maybe even like in a struggle or some sort of battle or, managing their kind of fear of missing out. So bedtime, I would say, like it's maybe not like a window. It's better instead of just like a rhythm where all these things have to kind of come together. It's not really like a cliff where you get to this point where like if you miss this window, you'll never recapture it. It's more complex than that. So you got to find a bedtime that's both developmentally appropriate but also biologically realistic for that individual child. I'll probably talk about this myth the most because it's like such a hot topic. Big topic for families, big topic for culture right now. As a matter of fact, because it's on the American Academy of Pediatrics kind of like guidelines, when you go to your pediatricians, well checked, they'll definitely tell you all sorts of things about screens and blue light and sleep and things like that, and when you should be turning off screens and whatnot. So the myth is that screens and blue light are the whole problem, and I would say it's, even though that's a common message, whether the screen actually itself and then whatever's going on with the screen itself is bad, or whether because of the blue light, because there's like a lot of talk about blue light these days. It's not really completely wrong. It's just that it's really very incomplete. And so screens can impair sleep, but it's really just not usually for the reasons that most people think about, especially for kids, adolescents. And I would say that the research has shown that really kind of all screen use is not equal, right? So timing matters, content matters, how much you're interacting with that content, whether the screen is in the bed actually seems like it matters, whether it delays bedtime or becomes part of the kid's sleep association, like what kind of like this is the thing that I do that helps me, that kind of connects in space and time with like falling asleep. And believe it or not, there's actually a good a decent chunk of like some studies that talk about how like watching TV is substantially different in terms of any sort of effects versus other kinds of screens. And we're thinking that's because it might be more passive. So the research actually coming out is suggesting that blue light from devices is almost near zero if you actually get enough outside daylight time. It is often overemphasized as a factor compared to like all the other kind of behavioral factors that you would think about. And it's also like really overemphasized in comparison to how little we talk about how early and total daylight, like kind of like daylight exposure kids get is like super important. Like we do know that. So, I mean, just as a real quick, like this all kind of came from like a 2015 Harvard study. They had this one study that really kind of suggested like, oh, like reading an ebook versus a printed book could delay your sleep by 10 minutes and delay melatonin onset by an hour and a half. And so because of that, it got run through like a lot of social media and content makers and was popularized. And then we have this whole new message of blue light's bad. And so they're like putting on blue light blocking sunglasses. We're also talking about like doing other kinds of supplementation and figuring out dimming our screens and coming up with like a different screen filters, things like that. And the truth is, the effects of all this are the blue light seem to be really quite low. And again, if you're getting adequate daylight, whether that's from like windows in a room and bright office light, because there are guidelines for how bright office light should be usually. You're talking like maybe like the most recent study that came out actually just this year talked about like you might get, and there's actually about maybe like 10 or 11 studies that talk about like this is just going to delay sleep maybe like by 5 minutes for most folks. Now, there's a lot we don't know about like really early kids, like young age kids, because the studies haven't really focused on them a lot. But the mechanisms we're presuming would actually be probably pretty similar. So the issues are kind of like a little bit, again, more nuanced. And I'm just showing this slide, for the sake of it. But this is actually, if you needed to kind of have someone to reach out to or look up in terms of understanding like the more recent research around this area, Michael Gradisar is a great guy to look up. But there's so many things that are going on in terms of like, what are some things that, is causing the problem with this issue of technology use and what it does to like people's sleep and how it gets used. So, but I would say like my take home is that, from this perspective, watching a calm show with a parent at 6:30 could be very different from interactive gaming or YouTube or texting or social media in bed, say like at 10:30 at night, right? So it's just very different. And we could talk about teenagers. They're just a whole different kind of topic. And so we could talk about that some other time. But I do think don't worry so much about the screen part as much as people kind of really drill that into you. There's so many other more important levers around sleep that people should be focusing on that if you have it as part of routine, especially for my neurodevelopmentally different or autism kids, I always tell folks like there's a way to build a better screen time or screen plan in. We shouldn't be worrying about this as much. This is always kind of like really a really kind of funny one because I would say, there's when I think about the number of things that parents kind of get told or handed, it's usually like in this laundry list of like good sleep hygiene, and like it gets kind of like handed to like every kid, and I would say it gets handed to every kid and every person within, that comes into like a specialty clinic for sleep. And sleep hygiene is like it's helpful, a dark room, a cool room, predictable routine, reduced and appropriately timed caffeine if there is caffeine in the picture, and obviously a comfortable sleep space. These are all things that can support sleep. And I would say we actually have empirical evidence that those things are important, especially like a cool room, right? Because for sleep to actually biologically happen, your body temperature has to drop. And so it's kind of like a feature, just like your body temperature rises as you're getting ready to wake from sleep. So those kinds of things they're all great. It's a foundation, but it's not a full treatment plan. And most families I meet, they've actually really already done this to most of the time. Like they've got the blackout curtains, white noise machine. Again, good data on using white noise in adults and kids and how that actually can help with sleep onset. Good empirical, it's good stuff. They got the special blanket, the weighted blanket, which again is kind of like it's got like some mixed reviews in terms of how helpful that is. But they're doing all these things and they've added all these things in and they're still having difficulties. And it almost feels like I did all the right things, but it's still failing. Like, what's wrong? And I would say, like, well, it's not that you did anything wrong. You just did everything that you should be doing, and you've helped us rule out all sorts of problems, and that's necessary. But insomnia is usually more about it's definitely more than just about the environment. So I conceptualize insomnia is again about sleep need, opportunity, and sleepability. Coming back to those three things I started off with. And out of those three, sleep hygiene really affects the opportunity for sleep, but it does not automatically create enough sleep to match the body clock issue. It does not automatically give the child the ability to regulate and settle, right? So a useful way to remember this is that, sleep hygiene sets the stage, but it does not guarantee the performance of sleep. And for chronic bedtime resistance, like long times to fall asleep, night wakings, families often need like a much more tailored behavioral response plan, not just like a prettier bedroom with all sorts of gadgets, and trying to find just the right thing, the lavender spray or whatever. It's not that those things are bad. It's just like, don't count on it that's going to fix the insomnia problem. It's not the usual case that solves it in most situations. Full disclaimer, I'm not a prescribing practitioner, so it's outside the scope of my license. So if you have any consideration or thoughts or use of melatonin, really direct those to your medical doctor. But I know, all I can say is like I happen to know a lot about melatonin, but it's also a particular topic where families get a lot of different kinds of viewpoints or mixed messages. And what I would tell folks is that it's not a sleeping pill. It's better understood as like a circadian signal that tells the body that nighttime is coming, right? Because your body produces melatonin all on its own, right? Small amounts, really. But as light tends to get darker at night, melatonin starts to kind of creep up. And as it creeps up and builds up, it just kind of helps kick off the next part. So, and I should say that melatonin can be used as like a hypnotic, right? Because it can help some children fall asleep faster. Not all children, but some children. But it's not really like a sedative in the usual sense. It does not simply overpower the brain into sleep. There's other drugs that do that. So it's not overpowering the brain. It's really kind of just part or adding to the already existing circadian signal that the biological night has started and we need to start winding down. And so that is why timing, target symptom, and the child's overall sleep pattern, matter more than just the dose. As a matter of fact, it's a dose response curve for melatonin. It only helps typically up to a certain extent, and then it's not going to do anything more for your sleep just by popping more, right? So, but it's really kind of like, when are you taking it? What's the symptom that you're targeting? Is it, something related to sleep onset, or is it related to like when you want sleep to actually, if you wanted to kind of like have sleep happening earlier or later? Because you can use melatonin in two ways, not just for helping fall asleep, but shifting that body clock of yours so that you could use melatonin for things like jet lag, or you could use melatonin for helping it so that you actually are waking up, early in the day because you're falling asleep also earlier in the day or earlier in the night. So I always like to think about melatonin as more like dimming the house lights at a theater before a movie or a show, rather than knocking someone out, which is like what a real sedative would do. It just simply signals that the next thing is supposed to happen, but the rest of the system still has to cooperate. So the first question you should be asking is not necessarily how much related to melatonin, but why are we using it? When are we giving it? what sleep problem are we targeting? And those things are the things that I would probably focus on. And I would say that in most cases, every physician that I know would say, like, you could use for melatonin. We would still suggest that in most cases you pair it with behavioral strategies in addition to my medical guidance, and all that kind of stuff. So I think that would be also good to know. They'll still push you that direction. I mean, the interesting part is that the United States, melatonin's over the counter. You can get whatever you want. Overseas, it's more typical the case that you might even need a prescription for melatonin. We just do it differently here in the United States because we classify it as a supplement. So that's my simple thing about melatonin. And I see maybe some things in the chat. And if anybody, I'll catch up on questions maybe at the very end, because I'm hoping I can leave enough time for some questions. So strategies that work. The theme here is I don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Sleep plans often fail because they're too complicated to survive like the real life of what's going on in the house. And so the strongest plans are really just the most simple, the most consistent, and most realistic. Usually the most important part for sleep is consistency, as with most things. So I often tell people also, instead of changing everything at once, I often find everyone does better, just like they would with anything else, choosing one target, define what it is that you want to see happen, and what you're going to do, and then just keep doing that. And give it enough time, right? Sleep change, depending on what's going on, could be a change that takes going through some different practices for 3 days, sometimes 2 weeks, and beyond. Not always like the quick fixes with certain kinds of problems. I will say that one of the things I would probably think about, like as a thing to start with, is usually like that, what I call like the morning anchor. So families often focus really kind of like entirely on the bedtime, but and that makes sense because bedtime is like when the stress happens. Like there might be some things to tweak there, but wake time is really kind of like often like that lever that anchors the body clock. So a consistent wake time, it'll help stabilize the body clock or your circadian rhythm. It helps build that sleep pressure more predictably across the day, and it makes bedtime like easier to interpret, right? Once it's stabilized, it really helps you understand like what's going on a little bit more. And I would also like to mention that morning light's really pretty powerful. It's probably the most single important lever you can pull for making sure the sleep rhythm is set right. And just to think about how this works, you can think of more morning light as kind of like pulling your sleep-wake schedule more towards the morning, and exposure to later afternoon light is pushing your sleep-wake schedule later on. So that's shifting the other way. So light in the morning helps tell the body clock this is the start of the day. I should also mention that most studies have shown like a pretty strong effect that more daylight exposure overall is helpful really across the day. And so I always like to say, like, if you can't get a lot of daylight exposure, if you're in a pinch, do kind of like, I call it like the walking the dog intervention. If you can get out and take your dog for a walk in the morning or something like that, just even for like 30 minutes, even on a cloudy day, because a cloudy day is way brighter than anything you'll ever achieve inside. Even just doing that for like 30 minutes, it might actually produce a bigger sleep-wake phase advance. In other words, help pull it so that there's waking earlier and then going to bedtime earlier because you started your clock earlier. And so there's some studies to suggest that 30 minutes could even be helpful. But regardless of whatever you do, keep it consistent. Wake time within about 30 minutes of any specific goal that you have is good. So if your wake time is 7 o'clock, making sure that you're always awake by 7:30, but hopefully more at 7 o'clock on average. You can get away with a little bit of, wiggle room, but not too much. So that's the practical goal. Again, you don't need to be perfect. You just need a pattern. You need some consistency. I always like to say, make bedtime boring in a good way. A good bedtime routine is predictable, brief, repeatable, boring. Doesn't need to be elaborate. The more elaborate they are, the more fragile they are, the more dependent they are on specific people, specific things. And they only tend to work when things go perfectly. So same order, low stimulation, clear endpoint, enough predictability so that at least like the kid knows what's coming next. For some kids, obviously we can externalize all that so that we can use like visual schedules, visual supports, things. And even for kids that don't have developmental disabilities, but things like ADHD, it just kind of helps reduce like the negotiation and the working memory demands that might be going on that could be really hard for them in particular. And of course, whenever we see something good going on, we just want to be able to reward it. So anytime that we have like a routine, we just want to, we're all kind of like aware of like what's going on and what's happening so that we can then reward cooperation as early and as quickly as possible. So my best test of like a good bedtime routine is usually, can the family still do it even on a hard night? And so if you can do it on a hard night, it's a pretty good routine. Bedtime fading is another kind of useful, simple behavioral sleep strategy. It's best for kids who will lay awake in their bed at night. So you might be doing all these other things in terms of getting early, a more predictable, reasonable kind of wake time. But again, if your kid's like in bedtime is 7:30, but they don't fall asleep till 9:15, I mean, it's really just kind of creating a lot more time for disruption, right? And so with bedtime fading, we typically move bedtime closer to when sleep is actually likely. So we just take a few days usually and just kind of like figure out like when is my kid usually falling asleep and say like, oh, well, maybe they're usually falling asleep at 9, even though I put them down at 7:30. So then what you do is you just kind of you set their new bedtime of like, their bedtime routine at like 8:45 so that they're in bed at 9 o'clock and it's closer to when they're going to fall asleep. And once they're falling more asleep more quickly and successfully, usually we move it forward in small steps, like maybe like 15 minutes every few nights or 15 days. I mean, or 5 days or something like that. It's a little bit flexible. I always like to also say that nighttime waking is pretty normal. However, adults do it, kids do it. Sometimes the estimates are like 6 to 8 times a night. It's pretty typical. Most times, we're simply just kind of rolling over, adjust the pillow, fall back asleep, and we don't even remember it. A common pattern, though, is that it's not really about waking. It's usually about returning to sleep for most kids. And the common pattern is that the kid falls asleep with maybe a specific setup. The parent laying next to them, the bottle, the device, the certain routine, and then once they wake up in the night, they want that last thing that they had, or the things that they had when they fell asleep that helped them fall asleep all over again. And it doesn't mean that parent did something wrong. It just means we got them to sleep because we need that. And unfortunately, the way that our bodies work and our brains work is that we now have associations, and our associations are kind of like making it hard for them to fall back asleep on their own. So the key issue here is independent sleep onset. Can they truly fall asleep on their own without maybe a parent needing to be there or something else specific to be there? And so the goal is that we're just trying to gradually build more independent sleep with fewer things that we're doing as parents in terms of our presence, how we're holding them, if we're holding them, whether it's a certain routine or some other item is there and that needs our attention. And so we need to do it slowly, do it thoughtfully. It also has to kind of fit with like the family's values and also like the kid's developmental level. Anxiety can also keep the system on. Anxiety and sleep challenges are pretty closely related. And unfortunately, anxiety is really kind of like an arousal state that's high, that's kind of high, and it's correlated usually with a lot of biological signals that a threat's happening. And so you have two systems fighting each other, your sleep system that's trying to kind of respond to your body being down, and then like anxiety, which is kind of pumping it up. And although we often try to do some reassurance in the short term, a lot of times it just turns into a bad cycle where ultimately the kids ends up being more dependent on us doing some reassurance with them. And it's not hard to develop. It can develop really quickly and easily, but we're all just trying to do the right thing and support our kids, but it really can spiral. And so we have specific protocols for specific anxieties, but in short, the idea is that we would probably validate feelings, usually find time and space for anxious feelings to be handled before bedtime, and then helping kids build a narrative of how they can be brave. I know it sounds very simplistic, but if I had to kind of suggest one thing that we could think about is moving bedtime to a point where the anxiety can be addressed and talked about, and other kinds of tools could be used, but before the bedtime. So not getting to the mind dump that happens right when they're already laying in bed, where things might become more pronounced, but coming up with like a proactive way to address it before bedtime, which means we have to kind of build that into the schedule. Now, lastly, I realize I'm running out of time, but you know, neurodevelopmental differences, it's just complicated because there's not only are there often more sleep problems experienced by these populations, like ADHD, developmental disabilities, anxiety, autism. It's more complicated, and generic sleep advice I often find doesn't always really fit them very well. And the basics that we talked about are still apply. It's just, and we should always work from the most simple to the complex in terms of things that we should do. But your kid with autism is just not going to respond to a vague instruction like, okay, let's relax. They're not going to do it. So we have to kind of come up with, how do we adapt a plan to a child that really is kind of exceptional? And, it would take a lot to kind of go through all of the differences that we do know about why sleep is harder. There's lots of hypotheses. I don't think we have something that's really truly like, oh, like we've hit the bullet on the head and we know exactly why it's hard. Some have anxiety, some have true circadian rhythm differences, some have melatonin, potentially poor production, really. Some have sensory preferences, aversions, the rigidity around routines, the communication differences, medication effects, because they might have medical comorbidities like apnea or restless leg syndrome. And so the key is just really kind of, you just have to walk into it knowing that there's not going to be one probably explanation, and there may not always be an answer. And whatever we come up with in terms of the plan, it just means that we're going to need probably multiple small adjustments over time, and avoiding obviously doing too many changes at once so that we can know that if we're doing something that's really helpful. So my primary suggestion is, we don't assume that same bedtime routine advice would work for every child. And it's, again, really got to match the child's developmental profile in the family context. I wouldn't even necessarily say that there's always like so many differences, but across like even like these three groups that I've kind of outlined here on this particular slide, it's just that, we have like some things that we need to be able to do for each one of these kiddos that might be a little bit more appropriate, but we could probably mix and match all these things together, not just for these folks, but maybe these kids that might have some of these concerns, but also you could think about it almost like for any kid, right? I think, one of the things that I love about the kids I work with is that they just teach me how to be a better human, to be more patient, and to recognize like we could just handle everybody as an individual. And it doesn't mean that you have to have a diagnosis, because all these things could be really helpful for any kid potentially. So in short, I realize I'm kind of rushing through this talk a little bit, but I like the phrase like fit over force. The interventions that we do should fit the nervous system of the individual and not the other way around. And it should match their ability to their verbal skills, their receptive language skills, their executive function skills, and how they're kind of like managing through. And obviously with that, means that we're taking more time to come up with like concrete tools, like visual schedules, the routines, and finding all the things that make up like a perfect mix for what's going to be helpful for kids. Things that you should always pay attention to are obviously like these things that need medical evaluation. Your doctor is going to be a good, obviously, a resource for this, because they'll help you kind of like screen for these things on a regular basis. But I always like to say the take home usually is that even though like I might focus on the behavioral component side of it, any one of these things could be medical contributors that you'd want to have like sorted out. And especially if you got persistent snoring, any of these additional concerns, you should definitely have probably like some pediatric or sleep medicine follow up. If I had to say what most anyone could start, say like tonight, pick one anchor. What do you want to kind of change or maybe kind of experiment with? Measure the pattern, which is usually maybe even like my first step, but these don't have to be sequentially. Track the sleep onset, waking snaps, wake time, lights out. Just the basics. Your doctor's going to want to know it. The therapist that you might work with eventually might want to know it, especially over time. Try reducing battles by making the next step obvious, predictable. Come up with your schedule. You could always reward success anytime that you see it, of course. I know that goes without saying. Definitely go ahead and schedule that appointment. If it's something that crosses your mind, just schedule it. It's probably going to be a month out or more. Just schedule it anyway so that you have it on the books. And I always like to tell folks, like, we all have ways of operating as families, but just check in to see if there's any other way you could do like your routines and who does what part of routines so that maybe it helps relieve some of the stress. So if you have someone else in your house, someone you share that sleep kind of responsibility with for helping a kid get to sleep, if there's any way to kind of trade off the certain responsibilities, and especially during certain kind of routines or parts of the night, see if you can kind of give yourself a break. Sometimes even variation is better than just kind of doing the same thing as well. And of course, avoid trying to fix everything at once. Sleep plans fail when they're too complicated. It also gets really confusing if you do too many things at once. So I apologize that there's not much time left here. Trying to see if I can do this.
There were a couple of questions, Dr. Shamley, and one was, is there any solution that you would recommend for early rising?
So early rising is probably the one part that comes up the most, obviously, for kids with autism, especially. I would probably say it's in the top 2 of things that I've often seen. So early rising is actually really probably one of the most difficult things to potentially manage. It comes with it a host of kind of questions about, again, what would someone want to know? They'd want to know, again, like what's the overall routine, or what's the overall kind of like when are they waking up in general? What time are they going to sleep? What's their activity like during the day? How regulated are they during the day? But let's just assume that everything is kind of like optimized, right? To the best that we know how. When things are getting to a point where they're like, no, we've done all the things, we have everything in place, we've even got medication on board, and unfortunately we have good meds to get kids to fall asleep a little bit better at times that they really struggle, but that doesn't mean that we have good meds that keep them asleep. And I would say that's even true for adults without some nasty side effects. So imagine we got everything perfect, but I would still say that at that point, it ultimately ends up kind of shifting to how do we manage? And so how do we manage a safe space, right? And I'm not endorsing this, but necessarily, like, I've had families that they do have a camera and they lock the door, so because there's safety concerns of the kid getting out of the room, but they have activities that they'll do in the room, or they'll bring them into the room, but they have a space for them to be in the room, but they're not necessarily sleeping there, but that's where they're going to be awake, and you're just trying to catch what sleep you can while they're there, knowing that they're going to be waking up at 3 a.m. This is kind of like where I don't care like who you talk to, people I've known across the entire nation in terms of sleep experts. We don't really have like something that becomes like, how do I get this kid to fall back asleep at 3 o'clock? Obviously, what's going on is there's probably some really interesting differences, at least in that point in time, that are related to their body clock. And we're not really quite sure what levers to pull to kind of make sure that that doesn't, kind of persist or keep going on. So it's not really great answers, but ultimately, if we've optimized everything else, I would say it's about keeping them safe. If there's still some things that it's like, oh, have we thought about like how this might be interacting and how this looks? Then, again, someone would probably be able to walk through more specifically like what might be a next step for that particular problem. I realize that doesn't give a lot of hope, but I will say that it would be not be unusual for a clinician to see a kid who has difficulty because they wake up at 3 a.m., which biologically, it kind of makes sense for everybody. Your melatonin is basically already peaked, probably around 2. Sleep pressure is off. You're in the lightest phases of your sleep more frequently. And so for kids that are hypervigilant, hyper aware, or just sensitive to their environment, and their neurochemicals aren't really kind of interacting with their body clock the same way, they're going to struggle with that. It would not be unusual.
Yeah, and this is kind of like a almost entangled in that question. You know, so many of us have done whatever we needed to do to get our kids to sleep, and then we have created that kind of sleep dependency on the adults or on the particular situation so that we get them to sleep, but then when they wake up, they're expecting the same routine at, 1 in the morning or 3 in the morning or whatever.
Yeah.
What is your I mean, I guess I'm just kind of guessing your recommendation for that situation is to just very slowly pull away one tiny little bit of those supports at a time and just kind of gradually try to move from full dependency to the environment and the situation and the people and all of the known associations to independent, sleep habits? Is that just kind of a
Yeah,
slow process, but,
it
pick
is.
one thing at a time to slowly pull back on?
Yeah,
Or do you, I mean, I guess the flip of that is, do you recommend, cold turkey and 3 days of hell kind of thing? What,
yeah,
what is your
yeah.
recommendation in terms of that entanglement, at 1 in the morning when we've created a child or a situation that's fully dependent on particular circumstances for sleep?
Yeah, I think, the usual scenario that it kind of runs into is obviously it's whatever the level of stress the parents are willing to take on. Um, and ultimately, I often kind of talk about too the fact that depending on how well I know the family, I might say like, you know, whoa, 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 I I know you, like I know that this is just going to be like too much for you to be able to stick with for the amount of time that you need to probably like make this successful. You might just make it worse because you're exhausting yourself. Things are trying to just like, and then ultimately you end up just going back to the pattern because you're so tired, right? So I would say in most cases, you know, trying to pull apart and find the substitutes for those one things, one at a time is probably helpful, probably the most helpful. But you're right. It's funny. I often find about with sleep onset associations, they take all forms, right? It's just like, oh, like they're rubbing your hair, they're rubbing your arm, or they got their arm around this way, or, and it's so idiosyncratic. It's so kind of like individual to the kiddo. Sometimes we're lucky and it's just like, it's not like 5 things, maybe it's just like 1 or 2 things, and we can find like something eventually that they're like, oh, that's good enough. Like you can give me this particular kind of pillow and whatever, and like it kind of feels like you're hugging me enough, and I can kind of fade out, like, and that's okay. Um, but your brain is just like so good about kind of like it just does these things automatically, and you don't even realize it's happening. And so my general thoughts are like, if you can, it would be purposeful, but like, yes, it would be kind of like a pretty slow fading procedure, or a substitution procedure for like each one. I just don't know if I've ever had anybody that's just like had like multiple things going on and they just kind of just like said cold turkey. Like that's what you do when you have like an infant and you're kind of open to the idea of like cry it out. But I think about most of my family is I'm like, well, they're 8, 13, 16. They might still be sharing the bed, or they might even still kind of like, the parents like, I just sleep next to them. I fall asleep when I'm trying to get them to sleep and I just stay there. Um, it's particularly hard. However, I I often kind of take it pretty cautiously just because I don't think I would ever want to sacrifice too much of the parent sleep for too long
Yeah.
to accomplish this.
Yeah.
The dangers are real. Um,
Yeah.
and it's, um, I think sometimes I would say some of my job is kind of helping people come around to like a certain level of acceptance.
Yeah, I don't want to hold you any longer than we already have, but the few things that you said that I just think are really important takeaways are that we need to figure out how to kind of alleviate some of the parents' guilt for the situations and the
Mm,
blaming themselves. I also think that this is just, I appreciate the fact that you look at the whole family and that it's important to you that the parents need sleep, because from a parent perspective, it's, not just about, gee, I'd love my child to get 10 hours of sleep. It's also about, the whole family, the whole house needs this help.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the fact that you kind of look to, that you realize that it's not a one size fit all solution, because I think so many of us feel kind of alone in this journey in general, parenting children with developmental and intellectual disabilities, but then that sleep piece just makes things so much harder. So I appreciate everything that you've shared today. I probably will rewatch the recording, and I certainly will share it, and I thank you for all your time and your information.
Yeah. Real quick question someone had also in this. I appreciate all those comments, by the way. I think Kim Dewar asked about what's the truth about chronic use of melatonin, and the truth is the jury's out.
Yeah.
The best data that we have is from adults, and it seems to suggest that supplementation of melatonin, the levels tend to just revert back to normal, typical endogenous levels that you produce on your own. But yeah, it'd be foolish to say like we know what this means like for someone that starts at age like 3, and then what it looks like at age 30, because I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah.
But I would say that the data that we do have, it's a little bit more comforting, just because it seems like it's not like a sedative and an active drug in that sense. So, with caution and the idea that you might be working towards eventually like weaning off at some point. I think that's what's also interesting too, is like sleep concerns can like kind of like, you could have a perfect kiddo sleeping from like age like 0 to 8, and then something happens maybe even at age like 12, right, the teenage years, and then it goes kind of haywire, where it starts early, and then all of a sudden it's just like things like really kind of like resolved, and like I didn't do anything, like it just it just naturally shifted to like waking up at like 7 or 6 and not at 3 o'clock anymore, and now I've got things are moving along. So it's really hard to predict. And if there's one thing I've figured out, that most things, it helps to give it some time. That's for sure. Give it some time and just see like the problem that is, really hitting you today might seem different, or might even kind of look different and resolve to some degree within like 2 weeks, a month, or something like that. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate all the information.
Yes, thank you very much. I know that when we saw you, my daughter and I, a couple of maybe a year or so ago, you definitely reassured us and made it, everybody lived their own version of normal, whatever that is, and it just, whatever we're doing, as long as we're getting a majority of the night's sleep, you're doing, that sounds good. And I was like, oh, that's so nice to hear, because it didn't feel that way when we, going through it. It felt like we were making all the wrong choices, but we were trying the best that we could, and you validated that, and I felt like it meant the world to me. So I think a lot of parents will get a lot of reassurance out of this. So definitely appreciate it.
I always like to say, like, if people are shooting you, they're shaming you. Like, just don't. Like, it's not a, it's so
it's not helpful.
Not helpful at all. Like, it's like, do you think I'm just like not paying attention? Do you think I'm like just careless? That's not how I found most families to be at all. I found that they're really deeply invested in their kids, obviously. So, but there is certain sometimes a tone, and certainly sometimes the things that they throw at you, and it's like, okay, like, not helpful. Not helpful.
How can people reach out to you to make an appointment, or to do a consult, or for your services?
So you can reach out a couple different ways. My information is on the Golisano Autism Center website, because that's where my office is. But you can also just by phone, it's 585-721-6208. People are also welcome to email me directly, Dr. Ken, DRKEN, at kdspsych.com. Those are probably
Yeah.
just the best ways, to be honest. Yeah.
Great. Awesome.
Okay.
I'm going to stop the recording right now.